Thank you, Mary Kate. I think I'll start off with just a few introductory remarks, and then hopefully we can have a robust discussion. I'm very grateful for the chance to be doing this event with Rod, because it gives me a chance to highlight some themes in the book that don't always get the most airtime, but which are in some ways some of the most central to the story of the baby boomers and the effect they've had on America. And those themes are religion and the family. Those are also the parts of the book that were the most personal to me. This book is not a memoir. There are not a lot of first-person pronouns in it, but the section on religion in particular is one that I wrote from my own personal experience. And so I'll start by explaining my own background and how I came to this issue. I was raised in Raleigh, North Carolina, which is in some ways the most average place in America. It's in the South, but not of the South. It's got a good admixture of Yankees due to the Research Triangle Park. My own family was not particularly church-going, but more striking than the absence of religion from my personal home life growing up was the total absence of religion from public culture. I attended a public school, and I cannot remember a single instance when anyone mentioned religion. I don't just mean that people didn't talk about their personal relationship with Jesus Christ. I mean that no one so much as told an anecdote about a guy from their youth group. I know that statistically, there must have been classmates of mine who were religious and attended church with their families and belonged to youth groups, but the subject was considered an absolute taboo. And that seemed very natural to me, and it was only later that I realized that by the standards of any other civilization, the idea that young people would be educated in an atmosphere where no one ever talked about religion would be very, very strange. So imagine my shock when I later learned that as late as 1960, a majority of public school students in America attended a school with some form of prayer, usually a Bible reading or the Lord's Prayer said in homeroom. I was only one generation removed from that world. That was the world that my parents grew up in. I was shocked still further when I learned about the Supreme Court decision that had abolished school prayer in the early 1960s, and what a travesty of constitutional law it was. The plaintiff who persuaded the Supreme Court to abolish school prayer nationally was a woman named Madalyn Murray O'Hair, who was a militant atheist. She later became a celebrity atheist and the founder of American Atheists, an atheist activist group. And more than that, she was also a communist. She had attempted to emigrate to the Soviet Union, so enamored was she of the communist system, and only decided to stay in America after she was told by a member of the Communist Party here that she would be more used to the cause where she was. She learned that her son's class in Baltimore was saying prayers every morning. And so she marched into the school principal's office and said, "If you don't knock it off, I'm going to sue you." And he responded to her, "There have been prayers said in the schools of this city since before there was a United States. And if our founding fathers had intended to abolish that practice with the First Amendment, they would have said so." So despite not really having a constitutional leg to stand on or any historical backing at all, Madalyn Murray O'Hair succeeded in getting the Warren Court to come down on her side. And in a decision that cited not one single precedent, they got rid of school prayer for all time. The baby boomers celebrate the school prayer decisions of the Supreme Court because they fit in with the overarching theme, the guiding principle of their entire generation, which they applied not just to religion, but across the board. And that is that individual choice is the only thing that matters. You can tear down all the institutional supports that you want, as long as individuals are still free to choose however they want. People can choose to pray privately, you just can't talk about it in public. From the perspective of millennials and my generation growing up in a world where religion had become not just private, but taboo, that focus on individual choice was clearly a false promise. This idea, the boomers told us that anything that can't survive without institutional support probably didn't deserve to survive in the first place. And I think millennials, from our own experience, would dissent from that optimistic view. And that is most clear, the failure of that boomer principle that institutions don't matter, only individual choice matters, is most clear in the other sphere that's on our agenda for today, and that is the family. The boomers obviously had a massive effect on the institution of the family in America, almost entirely negative. They destroyed the institution of marriage with their divorce revolution. They destroyed the institution of courtship with the sexual revolution. They destroyed pre-existing institutions of modesty. It was baby boomer college administrators who decided that it would be a good idea to have co-educational dorms and just throw a bunch of male and female teenagers together, and well, they can choose to be chaste in that case. So we're not actually, doing anything wrong. And the result, of course, has been the campus sexual assault crisis. And the family and sex is one area where I have to give the boomers some credit, because it's one area where the boomers, very unusually for them, admit to possibly having made a mistake. If you talk to boomers about the sexual revolution, they'll admit it. They'll say, yeah, we set everybody free and broke all the old rules in the 1960s, and that was great. Maybe we went a little overboard in the 1970s. Key parties might have been a bridge too far. And they'll say, well, okay, then the lesson of that is that we kind of swung the pendulum a little bit too far, but you millennials are perfectly free to now learn from our mistakes and make better choices. So it all worked out okay in the end. That is not at all how things look from the perspective of millennials. We do not see a pendulum that maybe swung a little too far, but has now corrected itself. I don't like to just throw a lot of statistics out in telling the story of millennials, but in the collapse of the family, there are just so many depressing and demoralizing statistics. I almost can't help it. The one that I like best is if you look at the percentage of 21 to 36-year-olds, people in youth and middle age who have never been married or who are unmarried. In 1965, it was 17%. 83% of them were married or had been married at one time. In 2017, it was 57% had never been married. Clearly, millennials are the least married generation in America for centuries. And this is not because millennials are choosing to be single. And this is the sort of rebuttal to the boomer overarching theme that's most important to us. Millennials want to pair off. There's just something about the institutions of courtship and marriage that stopped working sometime before we came on the scene. Recently, the Institute for Family Studies put out a study saying that 25% of millennial women are now on track to have no children. And 5% of women, if you ask them, will say that they want no children. But that then leaves another 20% of women who want desperately to have a kid at some point in their lives and who aren't going to have children, who are going to die childless because they just couldn't put the pieces together in time. So this is a book about what millennial complaints we should and should not blame the boomers for. And I think when you look at the collapse of the family, that is definitely one that the millennials can put at the boomers' doorstep. And so with that, I think I will hand things over to Emil to get the discussion started.
Well, thank you, Helen. That was fantastic. I couldn't agree more that the collapse of family and of tradition is one of the worst legacies of the boomers. It's been remarked before that as you go throughout your book, your admiration for your subjects really sort of tanks as you get going. And I think we saw that come through there. For those of you who haven't bought the book, please do buy the book, buy Rod's book as well. A lot of this is in the chapter on Sonia Sotomayor, who of course was in the news this week, swearing in our first female and first many things vice president. And I'm sure we'll touch a little bit on that as well. I first want to start with one of the passages from that chapter on Sonia Sotomayor Because we talked a lot about the cratering of religious belief, how millennials aren't going to church, they weren't even raised in church. You spoke a lot about that as well, Helen, with your own childhood. I can attest to that. I'm myself a millennial. Everything is couched in individual choice terms. Even the little bit of religion that we had was, well, that's my choice. You follow your own choice. But you write in your book here, and I have it here, that the Soviets gave much thought to the question of how you eradicate religion from a country. And you come to the conclusion that they can't oppress it out of existence. So I want to get Rod's thoughts on that, because I know, Rod, in your book, you write a lot about the Soviet oppression and the ways in which dissidents strengthened their faith in the face of that oppression. So, Rod, would you agree with that you can't oppress religion out of existence?
I think to a point. One of the things that in my church, the Orthodox Church, the people like to talk about is the fact that the Soviets were not able to crush religion entirely, that there has been a resurgence of religion in the former Soviet Union. And that is true. That's something to be grateful for. But when I went to Russia, one of the things that struck me was, in talking to other Orthodox Christians, was how close the Soviets came to doing that. You have so many Russians today who don't have even the basic vocabulary of religious thought, even though Russia has been Christian since for over 1,000 years. And I noticed recently on Twitter, there was a map that came out showing the degree of religious belief in West Germany versus East Germany. The communists there came very close to killing all religious belief. So I think that the reason I bring that up is to say that the religious instinct will always exist inside us. We will find some way to satisfy it. There was a new book that came out from Tara Isabella Burton last year called Strange Rites, Rites, and what she talks about the really crazy and exotic ways that millennials and Gen Z folks are satisfying that religious craving. I do think, though, that it is possible to eliminate or to come very close to eliminating a particular religion and a particular way of understanding and worshiping God. And I think that we've seen here in the United States, certainly since the 1960s, since the baby boomers began to take over the culture, we have seen any sense of Orthodox, small o Orthodox Christianity, whether Catholic, Protestant, or Eastern Orthodox. That sense has been dramatically reduced, not by government oppression, but by the sense that religion exists to feed the self, and that all of us have a right to be self-defined. So this is where we get into the idea of people in the US saying that they're religious, but in fact, according to the work of Christian Smith and others in the sociology of religion field, the de facto belief of most American Christians of the younger generations has nothing to do, or has very little to do with any kind of historical orthodoxy. So I think the legacy of the boomers on religion is to destroy any sense of religion as being something outside of oneself to which one conforms, as opposed to material that we take into ourselves and refashion to look like us.
Helen, who would you say is the quintessential boomer religious figure? I mean, you profile Al Sharpton in your book, obviously Reverend Al Sharpton. Is he your go-to here? Is there someone else who embodies the sort of moralistic therapeutic deism that Rod is talking about? Who is our perfect boomer representation of religion?
The one faith leader who made it onto my short list, who might have had a chapter in the book in a different universe, was Father James Martin, because he's somebody else who, again, is not a thoroughgoing villain. He has many admirable qualities and many great achievements, but I think he also represents something about the boomer personality. But as I was honing my list of boomers to profile in collaboration with other people that I trusted, and with the publisher, eventually we decided that there was no faith leader, no minister, no priest who belonged in a list of the 6 most representative baby boomers of the century. And that itself was perhaps a sign that in any other civilization, any other century, clearly a list of the most influential people would have had someone from religion on it. I mean, how could you not? And the baby boomers are distinctive in not having anybody who shaped them or represented them in that category or from that category. So I thought about Father James Martin, but in the end, I did not pick anybody. And that itself, that silence speaks volumes.
If I could jump in there, I think that you're right that when I'm thinking about the Catholic boomer experience, I couldn't think of any one figure either, but the entire clergy, including the bishops who weren't necessarily baby boomers, the way they handled the church from the Vatican II, which was a mid-60s thing, up until the advent of the abuse scandal in 2002, that was such a boomer kind of thing because it was a sex scandal, right? Where it was after Vatican II, that's when so much of the abuse was priests who came into service after Vatican II of that boomer generation. That's where so much of the problems were. But the older generation, they let so much of it pass for therapeutic reasons. I think about Cardinal Bernard Law's letter to the horrible Father James Geoghegan, who was the priest, the abuser priest, whose conviction set off the whole modern scandal in 2002. Cardinal Law wrote to him saying, "Yours has been a life of faithful service, sadly marred by illness." You rape children, but this is such a boomer thing to turn everything into therapy and to deny responsibility. So many of these bishops we saw after the crisis broke, they meant well. They wanted credit for meaning well. And that to me is also a very boomer thing. On the Protestant side, I was trying to think of a figure, and it would be too cheap to say the TV evangelist. And I don't think that's really fair to Protestants either. But I think someone like Rick Warren, who is a stand-up guy, everything I know about him is admirable, but that seeker-sensitive form of Christianity, of which he is probably the leading avatar, I don't think it's going to age very well at all, because I think it just, it's so focused on the individual feelings that it doesn't offer anything hard to hold on to when times change. I mean, do you have any Protestants in mind, Helen?
Not really. Not really. I think religion is fundamentally about how to make sense of suffering. And millennials living in a post-religious world, like you said, still have to answer those same questions without the use of religion. And the thing that I see in millennials' lives offering a substitute for that is literally therapy, is the language of mental illness and psychiatry. I think the overdiagnosis of depression and anxiety disorders and ADD disorders among millennials is going to be one of those things that we look back on in 100 years and say, what were we thinking? It can't possibly have been true that 40% of millennials had a mental illness of some kind. But that's what I see millennials clinging to as their alternative to religion. So if I were looking for someone to fill the role of a religious figure that would be analogous to a priest or a minister in a way that was relevant to the post-boomer generation, it would probably be someone from the field of psychiatry rather than a religious leader. That's where I would start looking for somebody to fill that role, not in any of the churches.
Rod, you bring up the clergy response to the sex abuse crisis, which I think also sort of leads into one of the counterpoints to Helen's thesis throughout the book. I mean, because you could argue, right, that, okay, yes, the clergy who responded to this were boomers, but they were shaped in a post-Vatican II world. And Vatican II itself was not the product of boomers. It was product of earlier generations, and especially the implementation of it, which we could, argue about as well. As the resident Catholic on the panel, I won't litigate that. But I think that the counter argument here, right, is that the boomers were a product of decisions that were made from earlier generations. They were simply dealing with the hand that they, playing with the hand that they were dealt. And I think especially in terms of the sex abuse crisis, you can see the seeds of that in a lot of the liberalizing reforms in the church. So Helen, how do you sort of grapple with that? What is your response to that, that counter argument?
It's certainly true that each generation is shaped by the one that comes before them. But it's also true that each generation has a responsibility to shape the next generation that comes after them. And I think the boomers should bear the blame for being exceptionally reckless in their destructiveness to religion, because they got all of the benefits of the old institutions, and then threw them away and didn't pass them on to their children. Boomers like to think of themselves as being post-religious and secular and having liberated themselves from religion. But actually, if you poll them, the percentage of baby boomers who say that they grew up in no religion at all is only 5%. The vast majority of baby boomers were raised in some kind of faith tradition. For millennials, it's closer to 25%. Just a huge portion of millennials lacked any kind of religious formation from their boomer parents. So the boomers got the best of both worlds rather selfishly. So they drew the best from the institutional inheritance that they got, and then failed to pass it on. So that's what I blame them for. Yes, they came of age at a time of disruption and confusion, especially in the Catholic Church. But rather than respond to that by being a stabilizing force, they just doubled down on the disruption. So they came of age at a crucial time, and it was on their shoulders to carry the tradition forward, and they failed to. So I think that's what they're morally culpable for.
Yeah, and your comments make me think about my parents who were not boomers, but I'm Generation X. I was born in 1967. But we were not big churchgoers either, but we were in the deep South, but we went to church at Easter and Christmas. But what was interesting was my parents, like so many people of their generation in our town, they felt that Christianity was so secure that they didn't actually have to pass anything on, that the culture itself would take over in passing the faith on. And of course, they were tragically wrong about that. The only reason I'm a Christian at all, because I'd thrown my faith away for a while, but I found my way into it on my own. But I still look at my mom. My dad passed away a few years ago, but I look at my mom and she has no idea about what happened. She looks around the world and sees so many people having fallen away from the faith, and she just doesn't get it. It's as if she doesn't see that their generation presented Christianity to us as a matter of social conformism. You know, when I hear people talk about the 1950s in Catholicism as being a golden age, I think that a lot of what some of the 60s kids were rebelling against had to have been this sort of idea of religion as something you do to be respectable. That because the 60s wouldn't have happened, things wouldn't have collapsed so quickly if religious institutions or the practice of religion had been healthy to start with. I think probably what happened with the older people who came up with Vatican II and also similar movements, reform movements within Protestantism, they simply didn't understand how radically the world was changing in other ways, in ways that would be that their structures would not be able to uphold. And I'll tell you what comes to mind is this great book, Edward Watts. He's a historian who wrote about the final pagan generation. That's the name of the book. He writes about the pagans in 4th century Rome, about how none of them could imagine that Christianity was much of a threat because Roman paganism had been there for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they figured it would be there for hundreds and hundreds of more years. In fact, they were dying out. And I think that that's probably explains what a lot of the pre-boomers, the parents of the boomers, the way they thought about religion, they simply couldn't imagine how quickly things could change.
So we have I want to start to turn towards our audience Q&A here. So if you guys do have questions for us, please do type them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. We have a question here from anonymous attendee, which I think is just teed up perfectly for you, Rod, to talk about your work and your book. But the question is, how might Gen Z and millennials organize to stem the tide of boomer secularism? What are the practical steps we can take, and how do we find other people who are interested in this movement? I think you've written at least one book answering that question.
Yeah, well, it's not going to be the sort of thing that we can vote into existence. It's just something that a problem I run into in giving talks about the Benedict option and live not by lies is that so many people seem to think that this is a political problem. Well, it's not. This is a problem that also we can't sit back and wait on institutional leaders to solve, because a lot of them are just as confused as everybody else. I think the main thing to do is to start taking faith so seriously as to understand that it's got to be a way of life. It can't be simply something that you affirm intellectually, but it has to be instantiated in ways of living. There are some forms of Christianity that are better at that than others. I mean, when I was writing the Benedict option, I discovered the work of Paul Connerton, a British sociologist and cultural anthropologist, who talked about the way certain ideas in primitive or traditional cultures survived modernity. And he wasn't talking specifically about religion, but there was clearly an application to religion there. He said that the community has to believe in a sacred story. They have to gather to celebrate that sacred story in ritual, and the ritual has to involve the body. There were a couple of more things too. For me, as an Orthodox Christian, Orthodoxy absolutely fits those criteria. But of course, you have to do more than just go to church on Sunday. You have to make religion part of your life. And this is true whether you're Orthodox, Catholic, or Protestant. I think that the main thing we have to do, Gen Z and millennials and Gen Xers too, is we have to be proactive in this. We can't just sit back and wait for people to come save us. It's not going to happen. Nobody's coming to save us. So go online, find people in your town, and get together personally. It's not easy to do right now because of COVID, but find some way to get together and to talk about the faith and to practice it among yourselves. Even if it's a small thing, it has to start somewhere.
Well, what's your take on this question? How do we pick up from the mess that the boomers have left us with?
That's really the challenge that was at the front of my mind as I was talking about religion in the book, because I was someone raised in a secular atmosphere who then realized as an adult, like a lot of millennials do, that a culture without religion is somehow lacking and a life without religion is somehow lacking. But my efforts to become religious from scratch as an adult were extremely difficult. And I felt like somebody who was raised in one religion and then switched to another is like someone learning a second language as an adult. Whereas I felt like going from no religion to a religion was more like someone who had been raised as a wolf boy, speaking no language at all, trying to learn a language, how to speak, as an adult. And that's just a qualitatively more difficult challenge. And I think if I hadn't married somebody who was such a sincere Christian, Rod and I are both Orthodox, which is pleasant for me. Usually at these conservative panels, it's the Catholics who outnumber us, but Team Orthodox is well represented today. But for people who aren't as lucky to have someone who was raised in a religion in their own family, it's a huge challenge, because if you haven't seen something modeled, it's very difficult to learn how to imitate it yourself, which is why I have a lot of sympathy for millennials, because I think a lot of them want to be more religious and for religion to play a bigger role. And it's just really hard to jumpstart that from scratch, as so many millennials have to do.
Yeah, if I can jump in on that too, Helen, I went to an evangelical college in the Midwest back in 2013 to talk about another book of mine. I was having dinner with some of the professors before I talked, and I was asking them what concerns them the most about their students and the challenges their students face. And one of them said to me that he worries that the students will never be able to marry and form stable families. And I found that really shocking as someone who doesn't understand the evangelical world. But I had this sort of stereotype of them as being really committed and especially family based and all that. And I said, how is that possible at this conservative Midwestern evangelical college? He said, because most of them have never seen a stable family modeled for them. And that really, and I looked all around the table and all the other professors were nodding. Yep, yep, that's true. That was so striking to me. It made me realize what a bubble I live in as being someone who came from a stable family and from a part of the country where the divorce revolution hadn't really taken effect, at least not in my generation.
Yeah, I think that that point about seeing it modeled and growing up in that culture is so important, especially as us millennials now start to look at raising the next generation. Helen, you mentioned how generations have responsibility towards those who come after them, and I know we both have young kids, and that's definitely forefront in your head is how do you pass on something that you yourself did not see modeled. Um, we have a couple questions here about these different generations. This one comes from Tom Zanke, and it says that given that the book shares a millennial's perspective on the boomers, I'm curious what Helen and Rod think about Gen X's role in these cultural revolutions, both in terms of how the fallout impacted us and how Gen Xers have responded. Um, I'm curious about that as well. Maybe Rod, you can start as our resident Gen Xer here. Where do you fall into this
Well, let me
generational
just say that
conversation?
I have my relic here. This is the first edition of Generation X by Douglas Copeland. And if I may show you, it has been signed by Douglas Copeland. So I was there at the beginning. It's so strange to think about what sort of profile Gen X might have in relation to the boomers, because we've always, I mean, the book Generation X was the first time I ever read something that stated or that defined the sensibility of my generation. This book came out in 1991, and it talked about irony, how we defined ourselves primarily by a more ironic take on life as a way of distancing ourselves from boomer sincerity. But you can't build an actual life on irony. It's you need to find something that you can believe in. And I think for myself, and I think about my own approach to religion, I'm famously, I converted to Catholicism in my mid-20s and then became Orthodox back in 2006. It has been something that for me that was fraught with a certain self-consciousness, because not only do you become aware that you are a choosing person, that you can't not choose in this society. This is the Charles Taylor point, that we live in an age when even people who choose to affirm the religion in which they were raised can't escape the knowledge that they are choosing. But I also had this very ironic idea in my mind all the time, this voice in my head, making fun of any desire to commit to something. The voice that was constantly saying that a commitment was something to be avoided. And not just because from a boomerish point of view, like you should always stay free, but rather from a suspicious point of view, the idea that look what the boomers did, that they've shown us that everything falls apart. That so be careful, be wary about committing to anything. It's better to stay on the outside, making fun of those who are committed. I think that's wrong, but I think that is a characteristic Gen X point of view.
Helen, what do you think in terms of how Gen X fits into this, coming from a millennial's perspective, who's researched obviously very thoroughly on the boomers?
Some people have asked me whether there's a note of hope in the book, and there really isn't in the book. And if I have any hope for American civilization, it does rest with Gen X,
Oh
because
Lord.
they are no pressure or anything, Rod, but they are the last generation that was educated in the pre-boomer world, that has some firsthand tie to the world that existed before the boomers started running absolutely everything. When I think about the public school education that I received and the values that I was taught from the age of 5, they were boomer values. And I think Gen X still has one foot in the older world. So they have some connection and some memory of when things were a little bit better and less messed up than they are now. So they're our last best hope.
Well, I maybe you're right, but your comment though makes me think about how, I don't know if this is a Gen X thing, but this skepticism and natural irony that so many of my generation have. I wonder to what extent that's making us react in a sour way towards the militant sincerity of Gen Z, the very politicized militant sincerity. I hear in them a less merry version of the boomers, no self-doubt at all, or no apparent self-doubt, even though the prescriptions for antidepressants maybe say something different, but they're coming at political issues in a very religious, pseudo-religious way. It's astonishing to see how puritanical they are about everything, and completely certain that they are right and everybody else is wrong. But again, I maybe you can tell me, say something more clarifying on this, but at least with the boomers I know who have that same sincerity, there doesn't seem to be that hard edge about it. They seem to be optimistic, whereas Gen Z doesn't have that optimism.
Well, that's the course of every revolution in history, isn't it? You have an idealistic generation that proposes all these new values, and then the children of the revolution end up destroying the original revolutionaries. The first chapter in the book is a profile of Steve Jobs, and I talk a lot about this exact dynamic as it plays out in Silicon Valley. Because Silicon Valley, these big firms, were mostly founded by baby boomers according to their kind of California hippie-ish baby boomer values. Be creative, don't be evil. Let's all be chill and relax and wear t-shirts to work and be creative. And also super tolerant. That's kind of the ethos in Silicon Valley. And now you see the millennials and Gen Zers who work at these companies being absolute fanatics. And the aspect of that dynamic that's most interesting to me is that the boomer founders and managers are so utterly incapable of dealing with it. And this is the dark side of baby boomer idealism. They just can't imagine that anyone would ever be so ill-intentioned as to be mean to anybody. And so in the face of this Gen Z fanaticism, they're not able to exercise any discipline against them. And so the same dynamic you see playing out at Google, you see in a lot of other places too.
Well, yeah, at the New York Times, for example, and at media companies, liberal boomers seem unable to defend liberal values. Is it because they don't want to be seen as unprogressive? Is it because they lack conviction? I don't know, but that has been one of the important stories of our time is the collapse of liberal baby boomers in leadership of institutions. And it's the same goes true at colleges. But it is really remarkable. I've heard from professors, younger professors, conservatives at universities who say that I think I'm going to be okay as long as the baby boomer who runs my department is there. But when he retires, it's over because the Jacobins are right behind him.
I don't really have an answer to that mystery either. I agree that it's one of the most fascinating questions right now. Why can't the boomer liberals stand up to these young fanatics? But if I had to venture an answer, it would be this. Boomer liberalism is a set of values that works pretty well in a society of people who have a lot of internal controls, who have self-discipline, who are able to exercise the discipline that other cultures handle externally with rules, with their own self-control. They've been well brought up. But the boomers had those internal controls because they were raised by a sensible moral generation. The boomers failed to instill those values in their own children because they were so allergic to exercising any kind of discipline. They were so in love with being the cool parents that they didn't want to be authority figures. So the values that work really well in a society of people who were well brought up like the boomers collapse completely when people don't have the internal controls that liberalism relies on. And I think that describes a lot of millennials and Gen Zers, and that's the heart of the problem.
Your your comments there remind me of a story I tell in Live Not by Lies, but it comes to mind a lot when I think about our own country. I was riding on a tram through Budapest with my translator. She's a Gen Z a person, a Catholic in Budapest in Hungary. And she was talking about how difficult it is for her as a Catholic to talk to her friends about the struggle she has as a young mom and as a wife. She said, just ordinary things I talk to them about, my husband and I are not getting along these days, or boy, I'm not able to sleep because my son, blah, blah, blah. She said, the first thing they say to me is, well, you've got to leave him, put your son in daycare, you do things for yourself. And she said, I want to tell them, no, I love my husband. I'm happy being married. I'm happy being a mom, but it's not always easy. She said they cannot imagine a world in which anybody should have to put up with suffering. It's also the case that in Hungary, the legacy of communism is very few people go to church anymore. So I was so interested in what she had to say about how we have created a society that cannot deal with suffering, with respect to what your remark that religion is a way to deal with suffering, to explain suffering and to help us to live through it. A society that denies suffering, that there's anything good about suffering, that the highest good is avoiding all suffering, is not going to be a religious society, correct?
Yeah, and I'll make this my last answer, and then we can kick it back to Emil so we can get more audience questions in here.
Oh, sorry.
But there's a sociologist named Zach Goldberg who puts up a lot of fun graphs on Twitter. He breaks down survey responses, and some of his most interesting graphs show the responses to various survey questions according to political beliefs. The responses of very conservative, moderate, liberal, and very liberal respondents. And one of the funniest graphs he has put up in the last year was one showing the answers to the question, in your lifetime, has any medical professional diagnosed you with a mental illness and said that you have some kind of psychiatric disorder? The percentage of women who describe themselves as very liberal, who answer yes to that question, is 56%. Wow. So I think there was an age cap, but basically a majority of young women who describe themselves as very liberal have some diagnosed mental illness. And in some ways, that's a funny laugh line, like, oh, look at those silly liberals, they're all crazy. But what I take from that is that there is an ideological component to our cultural obsession with psychiatry as the answer, because, clearly these are young people who at some point decided they were suffering, and they needed to make sense of it. They needed to derive some kind of meaning from that suffering. And psychiatry was obviously the place where a majority of them turned. So that's what makes me think there's an ideological component to the prevalence of psychiatry, that's where people apparently are looking.
I think that's a really interesting point, Helen. One of our audience members would like to turn that question almost on its head and start perhaps giving the boomers a little bit more credit. So this question comes from Joe Patton and asks, what cultural messes do millennials wrongly blame the boomers for? Helen, maybe you can take a stab at that first.
The grievances that I started with were mostly economic. I was really angry that all of my friends were graduating from college with huge piles of college debt. That when we got married and started having kids, we needed to put two parents into the workforce because the single earner household is just gone, has become obsolete. And feeling really angry that there was a time in the recent past, within my parents' lifetimes, when you could have a middle-class life on one income, when you could graduate from college and pay off a semester's tuition, with a summer job at the cafeteria in the campus dining hall or something. But really, we should be very careful not to blame boomers for the fact that they happened to arrive on the scene at America's greatest moment of prosperity in its entire history. The post-war economic boom was just something that they lucked into. So there are aspects of the economy today that are the boomers' fault and that millennials should blame them for, but the general prosperity that they enjoyed and that we do not is not something we can blame them for. They just came along at a really great time. Lucky them.
Well, I think that it's too easy for post-boomer generations, mine included, to blame the boomers for our own lack of moral courage on certain occasions. Like I could blame my parents for not raising me with any sort of serious religious awareness. Um, but at the same time, that would not get the burden off of my back for making these choices myself, making a choice to make this sort of commitment. I just am generally allergic to people blaming others for things that are actually within their control. Certainly what the boomers did in terms of religion made it much more difficult for the subsequent generations to maintain tradition or to continue to be religious at all. But at the same time, it's there. I one of the things that stays with me is a friend of mine, another Gen Xer, when I was a Catholic living in New York, we were sitting around one night complaining about the bishops this, the priests that, they're not doing anything. How are we supposed to live? And a priest who was sitting with us said, everything that you say in criticizing the institution is right, but you guys, you have so many opportunities to teach yourself about the faith because of the books you can get from Amazon, the internet, and so on and so forth. And I think that he was right about that. We found it easier to complain about the institutions not doing right by us. And I think that that is something that we need to be careful about and not offload all our problems onto that generation or any generation.
Our next question touches on a few of the themes that we discussed at the American Conservative in terms of localism and nationalism and sort of the broader overarching themes of our politics. It comes from Father Whiteford. And it says, it seems to me that many of the negative trends being discussed are the result of the denial of local autonomy and the imposition of centralized norms. This would seem to be connected with things like globalization more broadly, but with the centralization of power into Washington in the US. Should we not fight to reverse this trend? And if so, how?
That's
What do you
absolutely
think,
a
Helen?
huge theme in the baby boomers. Of course, the baby boom was a global phenomenon, and the 1960s were a global phenomenon. And outside of America, this was a constant theme of the student rebels of 1968. They hated Coca-colonization, the Americanization of their own home cultures. People who were students in France felt like America was just creeping into everything, and every American culture was dominating the things that they valued. And Americans didn't quite realize it at the time, but this homogenized, globalized culture was demolishing regional subcultures just as much as it was demolishing the cultures of European countries where Coca-colonization was prevailing. It was just harder to notice at the time because it wasn't a foreign country doing it. And that's in some ways the boomers' biggest failing. Was the failure to combat globalization and its evils. We identify the boomers so much with the 1960s, but in some ways, they are better judged by the decade when they were actually holding the highest positions of power, the 1990s. You look at the record not of somebody like Tom Hayden, but somebody like Bill Clinton or Tony Blair, the baby boomer presidents and prime ministers. They came to power at exactly the moment when globalization was reaching its climactic crisis, admitting China to the WTO, immigration, all of these issues were suddenly catapulted to the top of the political agenda. And it was the baby boomers in power then who completely failed to deal with it, who boosted globalization and held it up as a high good. So yeah, the lessons that they seemed to understand in the 60s, that globalization and Coca-colonization was not a great thing, they had completely forgotten by the time they were actually in power. And it's now left to the rest of us to clean up that mess.
That's exactly right. And, it's the hypocrisy of the boomers on this is so galling. They stood up, the 1968 generation, they stood up against the rigid conformity of the 1950s. But now what have they done in the name of diversity? They brought their own form of conformity into power. And they talk about tolerance, but it's that repressive tolerance of Marcuse. And this is the thing that just kills me about them, is that they're so pushy. And you have your chapter on Jeffrey Sachs in Boomers. Jeffrey Sachs is the would you call him a financier, an economist? But he was a globalist, right? And he everywhere he went, he meant well, and wants credit for meaning well, even though he ends up destroying a lot of local institutions. And this is how so many of them are. I think they're taking the crusade of individualism, of individual freedom, of everything's all about you, and they're trying to shape the whole world to that. But the world doesn't necessarily want that. And look, it's not just Bill Clinton. George W. Bush was a baby boomer too, is a baby boomer. And he had the same thing. They, on both sides, baby boomers talk about freedom and individuality, and they just can't seem to comprehend that the whole world doesn't want to be them.
I'm glad you brought up that Jeffrey Sachs chapter. He's probably my least favorite boomer, as a proud localist and a proud Virginian. So I'm glad that you included him in there, Helen. I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. We have an interesting one here from another anonymous attendee. It says, is it possible that the boomers' inability to defend quote unquote liberal values from woke types stems from the fact that they've never had to defend any values at all? They've always been on the offensive and undercutting values. Thus, they don't even have the vocabulary for it.
I like the sound of that. I'm gonna let the questioner have the last word, at least from my perspective. That sounds good to me.
Yeah, going back to the hypocrisy, that they like to see themselves as rebels, but in fact, they are insiders. They're consummate insiders, and I think we also have to keep in mind too, though, that when we think about the boomers, we think about the rebellious 1960s generation, we're really only talking about elites. The people who were in my mom's generation, would probably be a very early boomer. Most of the kids she went to high school with and were working class kids who the guys ended up in Vietnam, right? And nobody would have protested because nobody from our town very few people went to college. So I think that, there's a real class element here to that whole generation that is hard to suss out, because when the boomers who became media stars, whether in journalism or publishing or movie making, they made movies and wrote books and articles about themselves, people of their class. The great untold story, I think, is what the 60s and that generation's experience looked like from the point of view of people who did not have all that privilege, and who were actually fairly satisfied with tradition, but got rolled over by their co-generationalists who entered the opinion making and culture making institutions and professions.
Well, we have one last one here that would like us to leave it on a positive note. So Amanda Kiefer is wondering, what are some, if any, positive contributions of the boomers? Helen, I hope this isn't just refuting your entire thesis here in this one answer.
No, I have to give them credit for the music. The music is pretty great. Pop music has never been better than it was when the boomers were young. Emil, as you said, I've got a little toddler in the house, or an infant in the house. And as anyone who's ever had a newborn knows, you got to play him music. Music is an important part of soothing a little baby. And when I pull up Spotify, I find that I am not playing for my own little child the music that I liked when I was a teenager. I'm not playing him the Dismemberment Plan or Pavement. I'm throwing on some Cat Stevens. I'm throwing on the Beatles. So clearly my revealed preference is for boomer music. And I think that whoever, there's somebody at Spotify who could absolutely blackmail me during this book tour, showing that I am secretly a boomer lover based on my playlist. That's absolutely true.
Yeah, and I would say in a parallel way, boomer movies. I mean, there's never been an era of movie making in America that meets the 1970s, early 70s. You had directors, young boomer directors like Scorsese, Coppola, and others, Roman Polanski, making those great films. We just haven't been able to touch them since then, and I got to give them credit for that.
Well, on that positive note, we will leave it there. Thank you all for joining us. Go buy Boomers. Go buy Live Not by Lies from Sentinel Books. Bestseller Live Not by Lies, soon to be bestseller, I'm sure. Boomers. You can also find more of our work at theamericanconservative.com. You can become a member of the American Conservative and receive our excellent print magazine. You can read Rod Dreher's blog there and also engage with our work via our podcasts, TAC Right Now, which Helen hosts, and the General Eclectic, which is Rod Dreher's new podcast. So please check those out. Thank you all of you for joining us. Thank you to Sentinel Books as well. And we'll hopefully see you guys engaging with our work at theamericanconservative.com.